I'm very happy to be here with so many friends, some of whom of long standing. I no longer use the word old in referring to them, but a little frustrated because at this time, Grey's Anatomy is on, and it's the first time I've ever consulted on a script. And I won't know whether or not they listened to anything I said when they treated the Middle East and Islam. But tonight, I have the daunting task of addressing the topic, Engaging Modernity in the West, the Gulen movement. The reason why it's daunting is that when I initially accepted the invitation, I was very happy with the first part, Engaging Modernity in the West. I didn't realize that the entire conference was on the Gulen movement. And I'm not an expert on the Gulen movement, so bear with me. But what I want to do is contextualize the work of Fethullah Gulen so that one gets a sense of at least roughly where he stands as I see him in terms of contemporary Islam and some of the unique contributions that he makes. Two enduring questions in Muslim-West relations have been, is Islam compatible with the West and with modernity, with modern science, democracy, pluralism, and human rights? And secondly, is Islam in need of and capable of reform? I think it's a sad commentary on the study of Islam and the way in which we have engaged Islam for me to be able to say with great certitude and publicly that I've been in this field for close to 40 years, and I've been asked the same questions, including those two, for the last 40 years. The only difference is, as I like to say, I get paid more now than when I began and nobody cared about Islam. But these are major hurdles. They're not only questions about Islam and Muslims and the challenges that they face, but the very way in which we often phrase our questions and the way in which, despite a great deal of evidence, we continue to repeat those questions say something about us. And I'll touch on that later in my talk. At one level, the question, is Islam capable of reform? And are there Islamic reformers? Like many asked about Islam today, seems strange and even absurd. They seem to start with an assumption of Islamic exceptionalism, that somehow when you look at the history of religions, and indeed of most movements, and you see that all movements engage in a process of change and reform, the issue often is not change, but how much change. So some are more conservative than others. Yet there's a tendency to constantly frame questions as if this is a very peculiar tradition that somehow is incapable of change, and that if it talks about change, it probably doesn't mean it. I was talking to a reporter yesterday from a major newspaper. Well, not that major, but it's in a major city. But being from New York, there aren't that many cities that are major. And the person was asking me about, just by accident, by coincidence, the Gulen movement. And what was interesting was, we talked, and I put out some ideas, but he said to me what people have said to me for the last 30 years about many prominent Muslim intellectuals and religious leaders. He said, well, that's nice, but do they really mean what they're saying? So we start out with the idea that, post 9/11 in particular, that there are good Muslims and bad Muslims. And we ask the question, where are the moderate Muslims? Even asking that question has an incredible implication, okay? Then, and we set out criteria. Then when we find Muslims who meet that criteria, we then say, they probably don't mean it. They're probably engaging in doublespeak, etc. Well, in that sense, you'll see from my comments, Fethullah Gulen is too good to be true, operating from that cynical perspective. Because I think one will see, as I go through this, the ways in which he dovetails with some reformers and reformist thought, and the ways in which his thinking is, as with a lot of reformers, very much affected by not only Islam, but his upbringing in Turkey, the issues that have been raised in Turkey, the history of Turkey, as well as his broader sense of the world. Post 9/11, the call to reform Islam to strengthen its relevance in a rapidly changing 21st century has intensified. If some say that Islam is a perfect religion, doesn't need to change or adapt, others stress that Islam is inherently dynamic and that reinterpretation and reform are critical, excuse me, are critical in dealing with issues of secularism, democracy, freedom of thought, and pluralism. When we look at the thinking of Fethullah Gulen, a number of things stand out. He embodies a reformer who answers two basic questions of reform. Who's Islam and what Islam? Who's Islam? Who is to interpret Islam? Is it to be the religious leaders? Is it to be the head of state? Is it to be lay intellectuals? You look at his movement and you see a real mix in terms of the people who participate in that movement, cutting across every sector of society. When I meet leaders of Niagara Foundation, Rumi Forum, and Muslim intellectuals, I see a real cross-section of people who are reformist in their thinking. Fethullah Gulen addresses and responds to the second question, what Islam? As with most religious traditions, people who begin in any age to attempt to relate their tradition to the realities, some will simply retreat to the past and simply want to reassert a past paradigm. Others will look to the past, but insist that the heart of that past has to now be reinterpreted in new social and historical context to meet ever-changing needs of the time. In many ways, Fethullah Gulen embodies that approach. And so when he addresses issues like democracy and pluralism, tolerance and freedom, he does so from an Islamic perspective. He is open to other cultures. He is open to the best of Western thought, but he is also constructively critical of the failings of that thought. On the other hand, he draws from his Islamic sources, but he has no problem saying and assessing at times that he feels often that the East really doesn't offer very much or as much as it should be offering today. A cornerstone for his thought, and one that I think really then lays the groundwork for many of the positions that he then puts out, is an emphasis on the fact that what one is looking to is a reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. Very interesting because that very phraseology mirrors the great reformer of the subcontinent, Muhammad Iqbal. Excuse me. And he emphasizes reason and a diversity of interpretations of Islam, and that these have been integral to the history of Islam. In other words, that reason is very much part, in an ongoing way, of a process, but also that Islam has always been, to a lesser extent, to a greater extent, in various historical and social contexts, going through a process of reform, reminding many that the tendency that many people of faith have is to simply look back to their tradition and then romanticize and sacralize it and forget that what they see as a good deal of their tradition was actually itself part of a process of dynamic development and reform. And it's in that context then, and with that belief, that he emphasizes the centrality of freedom of thought and expression. On the one hand, noting that this is something that is very lacking in many Muslim countries and societies today, and is a cause of backwardness and oppression. On the other hand, emphasizing that Islam and an Islamic society is one that is composed of conscious individuals equipped with free will who have a responsibility and an obligation for themselves and for others to engage in this process of change. As the Quran tells us, God will not change the state of a people unless they change themselves. And so, in his own words, there's a sense that each society is responsible for the fate of its society in an ongoing way. Yes, God is all-powerful. Yes, God is omniscient. But it's not as if one simply expects that God is going to do it. Or one expects that one simply looks to a small group of religious leaders or political leaders. But indeed, that the Muslim community is a community in which there is shared power and shared responsibility in moving that direction forward. In particular, he takes on two very thorny issues that modern Muslims have debated. The question of divine and popular sovereignty. For many very conservative Muslims, there's a sense that, well, since God is the creator and just judge of the world, then we've got divine sovereignty and there should be no popular sovereignty. And then we have a variety of people, of course, who claim to be able to tell us exactly what God wants in terms of the form of government, in terms of gender attitudes, in terms of a whole host of attitudes. Then you have those that talk about popular sovereignty and say that popular sovereignty excludes any notion of divine sovereignty. And Fethullah Gulen attempts to walk a fine line between the two. He talks about sovereignty belonging to the nation unconditionally, and that does not mean that sovereignty has been taken away from God and simply given to humans. It means that sovereignty is entrusted to humans by God. And many of us know that the Quran itself says that human beings are to be the vicegerents of God, the caretakers, those who are to realize God's will in history. So the fact that God is sovereign of everything in the universe doesn't preclude free will and free choice. Humans are free to make choices in their personal lives. They are also free to make choices with regard to their social and political actions. And it is for that reason that he's able to then also talk about and address bridging the gap between Islam and democracy. On the one hand, he notes that Islam is a religion, and this becomes very critical, this distinction, in a lot of his thought. Islam is a religion, and thus is more than a political method, or a system or an ideology, a simple political ideology. He distinguishes between Islam, which is a religion, and democracy, which is a form of government that is developed by humans. But he notes that no single model of Islamic governance exists, that Islamic principles can support all kinds of governments. And that's why when some people want to look at modern Turkey and say, is this the paradigm? Much as secularists used to say of modern Turkey 30 years ago, that was the paradigm of, as it were, good Islam and good development. Or arch fundamentalists want to say there is a single paradigm and that they know what that paradigm is. Gulen is able to say there is no single paradigm, that Islamic principles, the heart of the Sharia, the moral compass for Muslims, is to provide a base of support on which peoples and societies, based on their local context, their historical context, their cultural context, then define what is a proper form of governance for themselves. So, Islam does not propose a certain unchangeable form of government or attempt to shape it. Instead, it establishes fundamental principles, leaving it to people to choose the type and form of government according to their circumstances. This then has an impact on his treatment of Islam and secularism. Whereas there's a whole tradition of people in the modern and contemporary period who've seen Islam and secularism as antithetical. Both people who are ultra-Orthodox as well as people who are, if you will, ultra-liberal, but for different reasons. For Fethullah Gulen, secular lawmaking is neither prohibited by nor antithetical to Islam. Therefore, having legislative and executive institutions is possible, and having these institutions make laws for the betterment of society is possible. And what he notes very carefully is that if you actually look at Islamic history, that's precisely what did happen. That is, that early Islamic empires and sultanates, while officially, for example, talking about the rule of Sharia law, also were enabled to implement regulations to respond to many of the contemporary needs that developed in their societies. Community members then are required to obey all laws, not only the laws that come from, as it were, the Sharia or higher principles, from revelation, from the example of the Prophet, but also laws that are made by human beings. And indeed, he particularly talks about that when he talks about the question of Muslims in Europe. And that Muslims in Europe should have, for example, in Germany, have a dual identity that comes from both their European roots and their Turkish roots. And that they have an obligation as a religious minority to observe the laws of that government. He does not see a conflict between the two, a conflict that often is exaggerated and a situation that is exacerbated both in Europe and America by those who simply say, no, wherever Muslims are, even as a minority, their goal is to impose Sharia. We see that being said recently in the post-Park 51. We see it being said in Europe by Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. We see it in a conference that's been called most recently by Daniel Pipes and Frank Gaffney, in which they're going to have a conference on Sharia and the U.S. Constitution. We see it in the comments of Newt Gingrich when he decided that he was going to say that he was going to get a law passed that would prevent any imposition of Sharia, when in fact there's no major movement to even do that in the United States. And even his understanding of Sharia is extraordinarily skewed. But in many ways, this approach addresses, because he sees a world in which, based on a right to reinterpret Sharia principles, the right of ijtihad, change can occur and an accommodation can be made in multiple societies, in Muslim majority countries and in differing kinds of Muslim majority countries, and in countries where we have Muslim minorities. And this is where his notion of the rule of law becomes very important, because he sees in Islam not only as an idea in Western thought, but he sees Islamic roots for the notion of rule of law, a notion of a mutual contract between the ruler and subjects, and thus that government takes its legitimacy from the rule of law, that all should be subordinated to the law. And yet, he is able to identify the fact that that often is not the case in so many Muslim countries. At the same time, he rejects a good deal of the ideology of many Islamist movements and religiously based parties. For Gulen, he addresses a question that many raises and responds to it by insisting on a total separation between religion and the state and opposing religious parties. Now, I don't necessarily personally believe that every Muslim society has to take that position. I want to be clear on that. I think there are multiple interpretations of Islam, both in the past and today. But clearly, what Gulen is demonstrating is that there are major Muslim thinkers and reminding people who read their past history and who look at their faith in terms of a contemporary situation and are able to say there can be multiple forms of government, and one of those forms of government can be one which accepts the total separation between religion and the state, and yet one that can see itself as rooted in a Muslim culture. And so one could look, for example, at contemporary Turkey today as opposed to Turkey just a few decades ago. For Gulen, Islam can be practiced and the issues facing Muslims in the 21st century can be addressed without resorting directly to politics. Therefore, he rejects the claims of Islamists or those Islamists who would say that there's only one true, authentic, original, pure Islam, and they know it, and that there's only one possible form of government and political ideology, and they have it. Rather, he sees many paradigms rather than a single paradigm. And his approach is therefore an approach of change that is a bottom-up approach to bring about a transformation of society. And I think that this is very important. If you look at a good deal of Islam historically, reflecting as many societies were historically, where in effect you had royal or regal governments, feudal societies, change was from the top down. The challenge today is to talk about change from the bottom up. But the challenge that many reformers have had, from early Islamic reformers in the 19th century and the 20th century, is the question of not just how do you craft a vision for Islamic reform, but how do you implement it? The failure of many of the Islamic modernist movements from the late 19th and into the first part of the 20th century was that there were many people who could provide an ideology for state and society, who could provide a new, if you will, theology for Islam in its engagement with modernity, but very few who took the time to realize that the challenge was, how do you implement it? If you don't implement it, then all you have are ideas that get archived, ideas that are in books and that people occasionally refer to and read. But if you look at the development of the Gulen movement, it's already been referred to here by some speakers. Here you have an actual social movement. So you have a vision that gets operationalized in a network of schools and universities that extends across many parts of the world, and that exemplifies an approach that basically says our schools will teach the best of modern sciences, math, etc., along with a reformist understanding of religion and its relationship to, as it were, a world in which we have not one single model of modernity, which is, quote, Western and secular, but of multiple modernities. And a vision that gets implemented through things like Niagara Foundations and Rumi Forums that, again, in many parts of the world, bring not only this vision, but reach out and engage people of many faiths, people of many perspectives, politically, socially, etc., in order to be able to both grow, as it were, and extend that global Islamic vision, but also to be able to reach out to others in an inclusive way and epitomize and demonstrate the need to have a partnership, because you can only with a partnership really develop a world in which there is mutual understanding and respect. So I'll bring this to a quick conclusion by saying that for those of us who are here in America at this time, in a post-Park 51, the so-called mosque at ground zero world, and in a Park 51, post-Park 51 world in which demonstrated the tip of an iceberg, what I see as a dirty little secret in America, one that we had no problem seeing in Europe, and that is that we do have a problem with Islamophobia, that we do have a situation in which a significant minority of Americans, at times approaching a higher percentage that many of us would like to see, do subscribe to a worldview which discriminates and would discriminate against Islam and Muslims on the basis of religion and or race. And I think we saw that in the reaction that then was freed up across the country, when suddenly, right around that time, many who, in isolated ways, we've had these actions before, objections to mosques, but usually it was, well, there'll be traffic problems. Suddenly you had people who could take phrases like, we don't want a mosque because it will be a monument to terrorism. People who could object to having a mosque in their neighborhood, not because they were worried about some extremist, but because they believed that there was something inherent in the religion of Islam and in a significant number of Muslims. And indeed, our hard data demonstrates that now. 10 years ago, people could just say, well, that's what you think. If you look at Gallup polling, if you look at Pew polling, we have significant percentages of Americans who, when asked, what do you admire about Islam or Muslims, 57% say nothing or I don't know. Significant percentages of Americans who admit that their level of prejudice towards Muslims is twice their level of prejudice towards any other religion. Significant number of Americans who say that they don't believe Muslims can be loyal citizens. And it is indeed the reformist outlook of people like Gulen and others that becomes very important as a message to these voices of discrimination and hate, but also becomes very important as a message within the Muslim world. Because one does realize that the situation in Islam and the Muslim world, just as it is, from my point of view, receded politically in the 30 or 40 years of my career, so that things look worse in Israel and Palestine, and worse in many parts of the Middle East, and worse in terms of Western-Muslim relations, but also within many Muslim societies. The rise of a kind of militant form of Islam, and also the swing back to a kind of ultra-orthodoxy, which also, by the way, that swing back also exists in contemporary Christianity and Hinduism today. But all of those forces are out there, and they underscore even more the importance of a reformer like Fethullah Gulen. Thank you.
One of the greatest religious leaders in this city was the late Cardinal Bernardine, whose driver, Monsignor Ken Vilo, at the Cardinal's memorial, gave away one of the secrets, namely that whenever his driver, Father Vilo, would drive him to any kind of occasion, banquets, dinners, or whatever, he always said, now there's one fundamental basic question I have for you. How quickly can we get out of there? The tyranny of this clock up here tells us we're 5 minutes past our contract with you, and I'm not going to spend your time because we have a lot of time in the days ahead to enjoy each other. But I think as we go out in the dark of the night, we could take with us some of the light of what we've experienced already and carry forth into the next couple of days ahead. It seems to me that we had in the address by Dr. Espesito, and the cordiality and the kindness and the good food and the company and all that went with it, kind of a foretaste of what is to come among us. And it's heightened by an invention that doesn't often get carried out into the academic worlds and the worlds of controversy. We forget how rare this kind of occasion is. Those of us who have experienced the hospitality of the Niagara Foundation on many occasions may begin to take it for granted, and we almost have to peel our memories back to the first time we were in that company. Because we're not in a world in which Muslims and non-Muslims, Jews and Christians of various sorts are in open conversation with each other. We can press hard issues because we build that up through this. Two of my colleagues have spent a lot of energy on this, teaching us the difference between an argument and a conversation. An argument is guided by the answer. I have the answer, and then I have to either convince you or defeat you or be converted by you or something. Argument is very important. You can't have legislatures without it. You can't have research without it. But for the most delicate things in life, and maybe the most profound, conversation, which is not guided by the argument, by the answer, but by the question. And I guess at all of our tables, we've been learning who each other is. We're beginning to learn the backgrounds, what we stand for, and that along the way. And I think that's very close to the whole Gulen movement, and so we are beneficiaries thereof. And I get to say, with thanks to the foundation and all of our hosts, good night.